The moment my daughter-in-law called me the maid in front of a stranger, I realized I had already been erased from my own family. I was standing in the checkout line at a small grocery store just off Maple Avenue, holding a basket that felt heavier than it should have been, when Jessica Miller leaned slightly toward the cashier and said, with a calm smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Don't worry about her. She's just the maid. She doesn't need assistance." The young clerk, whose name tag read Kevin Brown, glanced at me briefly, then nodded as if the explanation made perfect sense. For a second, I didn't move. I simply stood there, feeling the fluorescent lights above me buzz faintly, the sound of scanners beeping in the background, and the quiet shift of how quickly a person can become invisible when someone else decides their story for them. Jessica didn't even look at me when she spoke, as if I was part of the store fixtures, something temporary and forgettable. I had been told I was coming along just to help carry groceries for dinner at her house, nothing more. My son David had called earlier that morning, distracted as always, saying it would be nice if I could lend a hand. I remember adjusting my coat in the mirror before leaving, choosing something simple, something that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable, not knowing that I had already been assigned a role I never agreed to. Around me, shoppers moved through aisles with quiet efficiency, but I could feel the atmosphere shift subtly as Kevin Brown began scanning items, his movements slightly more careful, more polite toward Jessica, while I stood beside the cart like an afterthought. Jessica picked up a box of cereal, examined it, then handed it back to me without a word, as if I were responsible for carrying things, organizing things, existing only in relation to her needs. I looked at her face, searching for even a flicker of hesitation, but there was none, only a practiced ease, like she had rehearsed this version of reality before and found it convenient. Something inside me tightened, not in anger, not yet, but in recognition, the kind that comes when you realize people have been speaking about you when you were not in the room, rewriting you into something smaller. I had spent decades raising a family, remembering birthdays, paying hospital bills when no one else could, staying late when things fell apart quietly behind closed doors, but none of that was present in this aisle, under these lights, in this moment where a stranger was being told I was nothing more than hired help. Kevin finally finished scanning and gave Jessica the total, addressing her directly, not me, as if I wasn't part of the transaction at all. I simply reached for my wallet anyway, because that is what I had always done, because habits built over a lifetime don't disappear just because someone changes your name in a grocery store. Jessica smiled faintly as she tapped her card, then turned slightly toward me and said softly, almost casually, "Let's go. We're done here." The same way someone might speak to a person whose time no longer mattered. And as I followed her out toward the automatic doors, I noticed something strange, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet realization settling in, that no one had corrected her, no one had asked who I really was, and I began to understand that the story I thought I was living in might not belong to me anymore. The silence inside the car felt heavier than anything I had carried in years as Jessica drove out of the grocery store parking lot without asking if I needed anything, without looking at me even once, and I sat in the passenger seat staring at my own reflection in the window, noticing how easily a person can be reduced to something background, something unimportant, something mistaken without correction. And I kept replaying the way the cashier Kevin Brown had nodded, as if my entire existence had been explained in a single sentence that required no further thought. Jessica tapped her fingers lightly on the steering wheel as she drove through Maple Avenue, her attention fixed ahead, calm, composed, almost satisfied in a way I could not immediately name, while I remained still beside her, holding the same grocery list I had prepared that morning, the ink slightly smudged from my grip. We passed a row of small shops, a pharmacy, and a bakery where I once used to stop with my son David when he was younger, when he would hold my hand without hesitation, before life became divided into separate calendars and polite phone calls. I wondered when exactly I had stopped being recognized as a person in my own family and started becoming something else, something easier to label and dismiss. Jessica finally spoke after several minutes, her tone casual, almost conversational, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, asking if I could remember to unload the groceries quickly because she had dinner plans to prepare, and I nodded automatically before I even processed her words, because that is what I had always done, adapt, adjust, stay useful. When we arrived at her house, a modern two-story home with a wide driveway and perfectly trimmed hedges, she handed me the grocery bags without hesitation and walked past me toward the front door, already checking her phone, already leaving me in a role that had been assigned without discussion. I followed behind her into the kitchen, placing bags on the counter as she began rearranging them, separating items as if I had done something wrong in the way I packed them. There was no mention of what had been said in the store, no acknowledgement of the cashier, no correction of any kind. Only a continuation of the assumption that I was there to assist, not to belong. I remember standing there for a moment, watching her move through the space with certainty, thinking about how quickly a narrative becomes reality when no one challenges it, how easily silence becomes agreement. Jessica asked me to start prepping vegetables, pointing to a cutting board near the sink, and I did so without argument, my hands moving out of habit more than instruction, while my mind remained elsewhere, still inside that grocery store aisle where Kevin Brown had looked past me as if I was invisible. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the backyard, and I felt a strange detachment, as if I was observing my own life from a distance I could not easily return from. Jessica's phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter, and she glanced at it each time with a faint smile, never once explaining who she was speaking to, never once including me in the moment as anything other than background presence. I began to realize that what had happened in the store was not an isolated mistake, but part of something larger, something already in motion long before I stepped into that aisle. And I stood there quietly with the sound of running water filling the sink, understanding that the most unsettling part was not being misidentified, but how naturally everyone around me accepted it. The sound of the knife against the cutting board became the only steady rhythm in the kitchen as I continued preparing vegetables that I had not been asked if I wanted to prepare, and Jessica moved in and out of the room with her phone still in her hand, occasionally glancing at what I was doing without offering guidance or conversation, as if my presence in her home was both expected and unremarkable. I tried to focus on the familiar motions, the peeling, the slicing, the simple order of tasks that once brought me comfort in my own kitchen, but everything here felt slightly misaligned, like I had stepped into a version of daily life where I had been reassigned without notification. At one point, Jessica stopped beside the counter and adjusted a grocery bag, removing items and placing them into her refrigerator with precise movements, then paused briefly and told me to be careful not to mix the produce because she preferred things organized a certain way, her tone calm but firm, carrying the subtle authority of someone used to not being questioned. I nodded without responding, not because I agreed, but because I was still trying to understand how a single moment in a grocery store could follow me so completely into someone else's home, as if the words spoken there had rewritten my identity in ways I had not consented to. While I continued working, my thoughts drifted back to Kevin Brown at the checkout counter, the way he had accepted Jessica's description without hesitation, the way his eyes had moved past me so easily, and I found myself wondering if I had somehow become invisible not just to her, but to anyone who heard her version of reality first. Jessica suddenly mentioned that her husband, my son David, would be late returning home from work that evening, speaking casually about his schedule as if I were simply part of the household environment and not his mother, and I felt a quiet tightening in my chest at how naturally she positioned me outside of that relationship. She then asked if I could stay a bit longer after dinner to help clean up, adding that it would be easier for everyone if I just handled the kitchen, a phrase she used without looking at me, already moving on to another thought before I could respond. I agreed again, because agreement had become my default language in situations where disagreement seemed to carry no weight. Later, while she stepped away to take a phone call, I stood alone in the kitchen and looked out the window toward the driveway where I had arrived less than an hour earlier, trying to locate the point where familiarity had shifted into something unfamiliar. I noticed how neatly everything in her home was arranged, how every surface suggested control, and I began to understand that control was not always loud or forceful, but sometimes quiet, consistent, and accepted by everyone except the person it was being applied to. When Jessica returned, she briefly checked the food I had prepared, made a small adjustment to the placement of a dish, and then said it looked acceptable, which should have been a simple comment, but landed with a weight I could not immediately explain. In that moment, I realized I was no longer being treated as a guest or even as family, but as someone temporarily permitted to function within a role that had already been defined without my input. And as I stood there with the kitchen light reflecting off the polished counters, I understood that what had begun in a grocery store was not ending here, but continuing quietly, as if it had always been true. The kitchen had already begun to feel less like a place I was helping in, and more like a space I was temporarily allowed to occupy under silent conditions I did not fully understand. And as I continued to arrange the final dishes on the counter, I noticed how Jessica moved with increasing ease around me, no longer adjusting her behavior even slightly, as if my presence had become fully integrated into her expectations. She checked her phone again, then informed me without looking up that dinner would be simple tonight because she and David had already eaten earlier that day, a detail she mentioned casually, as if my participation in the meal had never truly been considered. I paused for a moment holding a serving spoon, feeling something shift quietly in my understanding of the evening, not because I was hungry or expecting food, but because of how naturally I had been positioned outside of something that should have included me without question. Jessica continued speaking about weekend plans, mentioning friends I did not know and events I had not been invited to, her voice carrying the ease of someone describing a life already fully separate from mine, while I stood in the same kitchen absorbing the rhythm of her words without interruption. At one point, she glanced toward the hallway and reminded me again about cleaning up after dinner, adding that it would be helpful if I could also organize the pantry since things tended to get messy when she was busy, and I simply nodded, recognizing that my responses had become automatic, detached from any expectation that I might be included in decision-making. While she set the table, I found myself thinking back further, beyond the grocery store, beyond even that afternoon, to earlier years when David still lived at home and would ask me to sit with him while he studied, when my role in the household had never needed explanation or permission. That memory felt distant now, not because it was unclear, but because it belonged to a version of life where my presence had been assumed rather than assigned. Jessica's phone rang again, and she stepped away to answer it, her voice lowering as she spoke to someone on the other end, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the faint sound of water running from the sink I had not fully turned off. I looked at the organized rows of food on the counter and realized how easily order could be mistaken for belonging when no one questioned who created it or who was meant to remain inside it. When Jessica returned, she briefly glanced at my work again and made a small correction to the placement of a dish, then said thank you in a tone that was polite but distant, like something offered to confirm function rather than connection. In that moment, I understood that nothing about my presence here required acknowledgement beyond usefulness, and as I stood there with the evening light fading outside the window, I felt the quiet weight of something settling in, not as an emotion that demanded attention, but as a realization that I had been slowly placed into a version of my own life where I no longer determined the role I was expected to play. The evening had settled deeper into the house by the time Jessica returned to the kitchen, and the air felt heavier not because anything had changed outwardly, but because I had begun to notice the consistency of how I was being placed within every moment, as if my presence was only ever meant to fill gaps rather than belong to the structure itself. She walked past me without stopping, placing her phone on the counter and checking the dishes I had arranged earlier with a quick glance that carried neither approval nor disapproval, only evaluation, as if she were confirming that a task had been completed correctly by someone whose role required no further acknowledgement. I stood near the sink, wiping my hands slowly even though there was nothing left to clean, because I had started to understand that movement itself had become a form of permission to remain in the space. Jessica mentioned that David would not be joining dinner at all, explaining it briefly as a change in his schedule, and she did not look at me while saying it, which made the words feel less like information and more like confirmation of something already decided without my awareness. I nodded out of habit, though the gesture felt unnecessary in a room where no one was truly asking anything of me beyond function. A few minutes later, she asked me to check the oven temperature again, even though it had already been set correctly, and I complied without question, watching the dial as if precision could somehow restore clarity to what I was beginning to feel. The kitchen light reflected softly off the countertop, and I noticed how carefully everything had been arranged around me, not just the food but the rhythm of the household itself, as if every action followed a script that I had not been given the chance to read. Jessica moved between cabinets and drawers with ease, occasionally adjusting small details, and each correction she made seemed to reinforce an unspoken assumption that I was there to assist rather than participate. At one point, she paused and mentioned casually that it was helpful having someone reliable around the house, a statement that sounded polite on the surface but carried an underlying finality, as if reliability was the highest position I could expect to occupy. I remember turning slightly toward her, waiting for some indication that the sentence included me as something more than utility, but she had already moved on to another task, her attention fully absorbed in her own direction. The sound of plates being set on the table echoed softly through the kitchen, and I realized I was no longer being guided or corrected as much as I was being directed through assumptions that no one thought necessary to explain. I thought briefly of Kevin Brown at the grocery store, of how easily he had accepted the role Jessica assigned me without hesitation, and I began to understand that the version of me being spoken into existence was not new, but already practiced, already accepted by more than just one person. As Jessica finally stepped out of the kitchen to take another call, I remained standing there, looking at the prepared meal, the organized counters, and the quiet order of a space that functioned perfectly without ever needing to recognize who maintained it. And in that stillness, I felt something settle inside me that was not confusion anymore, but the early recognition that being unseen was not an accident here. It was a pattern that had already been fully established long before I arrived. When Jessica returned to the kitchen, she no longer spoke about tasks or schedules, but instead mentioned casually that she might be hosting friends over the weekend, her voice light and indifferent, as if the presence of others in the house was a detail unrelated to me, even though I was still standing there listening. I noticed how quickly conversations moved past my position, how naturally I was excluded from anything that extended beyond immediate usefulness, and I began to understand that silence was not just something I was experiencing, but something that was being used to define me. Jessica opened a cabinet and rearranged a few plates without urgency, then asked me if I could also wipe down the dining table after dinner, not as a request, but as an expectation already decided, and I answered yes without hesitation, because by now hesitation felt unnecessary in a space where decisions were no longer negotiated. The sound of distant traffic outside the house mixed with the quiet clinking of dishes, creating a steady background that made everything inside feel even more controlled, more intentional, as if every movement had been placed carefully into position before I arrived. I remember standing near the sink again, watching the water run for longer than needed, not because anything required washing, but because standing still felt more noticeable than continuing to move. Jessica's phone rang once more, and she answered it while walking out of the kitchen, her tone shifting immediately into a conversational ease that excluded me entirely, and I found myself listening less to her words and more to the absence of any acknowledgement of my presence. In that moment, I thought about David again, not as a child or even as a son I was actively waiting for, but as someone whose absence in these interactions had become the structure everything else was built around. When Jessica returned, she checked the oven one more time, even though it had already been confirmed ready, and I realized that repetition was not about necessity, but about control, about reinforcing who was expected to act and who was expected to observe. She briefly mentioned that tomorrow would be busy and that she might need help organizing a few things around the house, and I nodded again, though the word help felt increasingly misplaced, as if it no longer described what I was being asked to do. The dinner itself passed quietly, with minimal conversation, and I was not asked to sit in a specific place or join in any meaningful way, but simply moved where there was space, as if my position in the room was flexible depending on what was needed. At one point, Jessica laughed softly at something on her phone, sharing it briefly with someone I could not see, and I noticed how easily joy or attention could exist fully without me being part of its origin or its direction. After dinner, as I began to clear the table, I realized that no one had instructed me to do so, because instruction had become unnecessary long ago, replaced instead by expectation that had never been spoken out loud but was always understood. The house remained calm, structured, and efficient around me, and I stood there surrounded by that order, finally recognizing that what I had been calling assistance was not participation at all, but a role I had already been placed into long before I ever realized I had stopped being asked. The next morning arrived quietly, with pale light filtering through the kitchen windows and the house already in motion before I was fully aware of it, as if the day had begun its routine without waiting for anyone's permission to participate. I was standing by the counter preparing coffee when Jessica entered the kitchen already dressed for the day, her phone in one hand and a list of tasks in the other, her attention divided but controlled, and she briefly glanced at me as if confirming my presence was still accounted for in the same way as the appliances or furniture. She mentioned that she would be leaving for a few hours and that I could continue helping around the house, a phrase she delivered without emphasis, as if it required no response beyond understanding. I nodded automatically, because by now agreement had become the simplest way to move through spaces where disagreement carried no practical meaning. After she left, the house grew quieter, not in an empty way, but in a structured way, like every surface and sound had already been arranged to function without interruption. I began wiping down the kitchen counters even though they were already clean, not because it was necessary, but because standing still felt increasingly unfamiliar in a place where movement had become my only accepted form of presence. At some point, I noticed Jessica's notebook left open on the kitchen table, filled with neatly written plans for the week, names and times organized with precision, and I saw my own name written only once, not as a person but as a task entry labeled under assistance at home, which I stared at longer than I intended before gently closing the notebook and returning it exactly where it had been. The realization did not come suddenly, but in layers, each moment confirming something I had already begun to sense, that I was being recorded into the household not as family, but as function. Later that afternoon, David called briefly, his voice distant and distracted, asking if everything was fine and mentioning he would try to visit soon if his schedule allowed. And I responded calmly, choosing my words carefully so as not to create concern where none was expected. I did not mention the grocery store or the kitchen or how conversations in this house seemed to move around me rather than through me, because I was still unsure whether what I had experienced was meant to be questioned or simply accepted. After the call ended, I remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, holding the phone in my hand while listening to the quiet return of the house around me. And I realized how easily connection could exist at a distance while absence could feel complete in person. Jessica returned later in the afternoon without explanation of where she had been, only commenting that things at home looked organized, a word she used without looking at me directly, and I understood then that order was being treated as evidence of something functioning correctly, even if the person maintaining it was never acknowledged. That evening, as I continued the same small routines of cleaning and arranging, I found myself observing not just the house, but the structure of expectation that surrounded every action I took, and for the first time I stopped asking inwardly what role I was supposed to play, because it had become clear that the role had already been decided long before I ever stepped into the grocery store aisle, where it had all quietly begun. I woke up the following morning with a strange sense that something in me had changed, even though nothing in the house appeared different, and as I stood in the kitchen preparing a simple cup of coffee, I found myself noticing details I had previously accepted without question, such as the exact placement of every item on the counter, the precise order in which tasks were expected to be completed, and the quiet way in which my movements seemed to fit into a pattern that had already been established long before I began following it. Jessica was not home yet, and the absence of her presence made the space feel both larger and more controlled, as if the structure of the house did not depend on who was inside it, but rather on the rules that continued to exist even when no one was speaking them aloud. I sat at the edge of the dining table for a moment, holding the warm cup in my hands, and I realized I had begun to anticipate instructions that were never actually spoken, as though silence itself had become a form of communication I was now trained to respond to. Later in the morning, while organizing items in the kitchen, I paused when I noticed a small handwritten schedule pinned discreetly near the refrigerator, listing daily routines, grocery plans, and household responsibilities, and my eyes stopped briefly when I saw how naturally certain tasks were assigned without names, only functions, as if people inside this house were no longer identified by who they were, but by what they were expected to maintain. I did not hear Jessica return, but I felt her presence the moment she entered, not because of sound, but because of how the atmosphere subtly shifted into expectation again. And when she passed through the kitchen, she only offered a brief glance before continuing to another room, not acknowledging me directly, but confirming my position indirectly through familiarity rather than instruction. I continued my work slowly, but my attention was no longer fully in the actions themselves, because part of me was beginning to observe the structure around those actions instead, noticing how easily every interaction reinforced the same unspoken arrangement. At one point, I stood still in front of the sink longer than necessary, not because I was confused, but because I was beginning to question why stillness felt more noticeable than movement, and why being noticed at all now seemed tied only to usefulness. In the quiet moments between tasks, I found myself remembering the grocery store again, not as a single event, but as a beginning point of recognition, where a sentence spoken casually had been accepted so easily that no one felt the need to correct it, and I began to understand that what had happened there was not an isolated misunderstanding, but part of a larger pattern of perception that had continued without interruption into this house. When Jessica finally spoke to me that afternoon, it was only to ask about something practical, something routine, something that required no personal acknowledgement, and I answered in the same calm tone I had been using more often now, though inside I was no longer only responding to her words, but also observing the structure that made those words sufficient. As evening approached, I stood again in the kitchen and looked around at the unchanged environment, realizing that nothing in the physical space had shifted, yet my understanding of it had begun to separate itself from participation, and for the first time I understood clearly that what I had been calling involvement was actually adaptation, and what I had accepted as normal might only have been repetition without recognition. I stood in the kitchen long after the evening had settled, with the house quiet in the way that no longer felt like peace, but like confirmation, and I realized I was no longer waiting for instructions because I had already learned how to anticipate them before they arrived. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. The lights above the counter cast a steady glow, and every surface in the room reflected an order that did not include me as its origin, only as its continuation. I walked slowly toward the dining table where I had worked the day before, and I noticed again how nothing in this space required my presence to function, yet everything I had done had been absorbed into it, as if I had always belonged to a category rather than a name. Jessica was not in the room, but her presence remained in the structure of the house itself, in the way objects were placed with intention, and in the way silence carried expectations that did not need to be spoken twice. I remembered the grocery store again, not as a moment of humiliation, but as a starting point of recognition, where identity had been replaced so effortlessly that no resistance had been necessary for it to take effect. I stood near the sink and looked at my reflection faintly visible in the dark window, and for the first time I did not try to adjust how I appeared, because I was beginning to understand that appearance was no longer the point. There was a small notebook still resting near the counter where Jessica had left it earlier, and though I had already seen it, I opened it again, this time reading more slowly, noticing how household responsibilities were divided into tasks without acknowledgement of who they belonged to, and how one line in particular simply listed support at home, without further detail, as if presence itself had been reduced to function. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back exactly where it had been, not out of obedience, but because I understood that disruption was no longer something this system needed to fear from me. When I heard footsteps earlier in the day, I no longer reacted immediately, because I had begun to distinguish between sound and intention, between movement and meaning, and I realized most of what I had been responding to was expectation rather than instruction. David called again briefly, his voice unchanged, distant but polite, and I answered in the same calm manner I had been using more often, though I found myself no longer inserting reassurance into my responses, only clarity. After the call ended, I remained still for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because stillness had become the only place where I could observe without being repositioned. Jessica returned later without explanation of her absence, moved through the kitchen without pause, and for the first time I did not follow her movement with my attention, because I had begun to recognize that her control was not something actively enforced, but something quietly accepted by everyone who never questioned it. I picked up my coat from the chair where it had been placed earlier, not in preparation to leave, but in acknowledgement that I had been waiting for a moment that would allow me to see everything without participating in its arrangement. And in that quiet recognition, standing between what I had been told I was and what I had always been before anyone decided otherwise, I finally understood that I had not been erased completely, only rewritten in a way that could still be corrected.